Welcome to the Way to Be Human podcast. This is a safe space where we embrace the messiness of life, dive into honest conversations about mental health, and talk about what it really means to be human. Today's topic is one that I didn't quite expect to talk about, but I feel it's incredibly relevant to what this podcast is all about: being human. Lately, I've been avoiding working on this podcast because, frankly, I felt uninspired. But then it hit me that that is exactly what I should be talking about: the feeling, the experience, all of it. Because I know that I'm not alone in this. We've all had times where we feel stuck or unmotivated. So let's explore why that happens and what it means. If you've ever felt stuck or like you're avoiding something important because you're uninspired, you're not alone. We're all in this together. This isn't about finding a perfect solution, but about sharing my process and maybe helping you feel less alone in your experience, your life, your human journey. So, what happened? Well, I started this podcast and I feel like I was filled with all this excitement and energy and motivation. But I got that first episode out there, and then I just kept putting off working on the podcast. I was telling myself that I needed to have the right topic or the perfect energy to record, or that the next episode had to be better than the first episode. Like, the list just went on and on and on. And what ended up happening is that I was avoiding and procrastinating. I'm using those words as two separate words. I think procrastinating does technically mean avoiding, but to me, they feel like two separate words that describe two very different experiences. And as I was avoiding, as I was procrastinating, I felt more guilty, more frustrated, more annoyed with myself. And that made it even harder to truly start jumping back into working on the podcast again. I think that this was happening because of my desire to be perfect and have a perfect podcast. In parallel with this, I think what was happening is that for the first episode, I believe I talked about this where, I'd spent so many times re-recording it. And then one day, all of a sudden, I was like, I'm just going to record again. And that ended up being the episode that I aired. And it just felt right. I just had that feeling of, this is it. I want this out there. This encapsulates all that I've been trying to get across with this podcast and what I want to do. So not only was I, for the second episode, fighting with perfectionism and this feeling that things had to be right, it was really difficult. And I did get the second episode out there. That did happen, but I thought it was important to talk through what I was experiencing, just trying to get to that point of even getting that episode out there, and now even just trying to get this third episode out. And I want to spend some time thinking about some of the root causes or the deeper reasons behind why I was avoiding and procrastinating. Some questions that come to mind are, was I afraid of failing? Was I being too hard on myself? Was I taking a rest that I needed but wasn't allowing myself to take? I think the answer to all of this is yes. I was afraid of failing. I'm still afraid of failing. Because of the perfectionism, I'm very much being too hard on myself. I very much was attempting to rest and wasn't allowing myself to take that rest. So I'm sure there's a bajillion more questions that I could come up with for why I was participating in this avoidance and procrastination cycle. Some other questions that come to mind are, how do I make sure that this episode is better than the last one? How do I make sure that it's perfect? Which right there, perfectionism. So I'll pose this question to you, the listeners. Have you ever avoided something because you weren't feeling inspired, even though you knew it mattered to you? Because that's such a frustrating cycle, and that is everything that I have been dealing with. Like, this matters to me. I care about this so much, and it's been so incredibly difficult to get motivated to do stuff and to push this forward. Even though I do feel like I have finally had an aha moment, which has helped me to really shift my perception of all of this. So my aha moment, one day I realized in therapy that what I was avoiding was the topic of a podcast. So I was sitting there avoiding working on the podcast, but in reality, that avoidance, the feeling stuck, those are all parts of being human. And sharing my experience could potentially help others, because we're not meant to always be on in this world. And I think society makes it seem like we have to constantly be productive, but in reality, that ebbs and flows. And I was having this whole moment of, wow, like, I could literally be talking about this on the podcast, because this is why I wanted to do the podcast. I wanted to have those conversations about those kind of everyday things that happen that are frustrating, or, just you feel like they suck and you want it to be different. So instead of seeing this as a failure, I really saw this as an opportunity to talk about something real. And I thought, if I'm feeling this way, then others probably are too. And I realized that inspiration doesn't always come before action. So sometimes you have to start moving and the inspiration follows. And I think of this similarly to the saying, or I think this is like something from physics, maybe. I don't know. It's been a while since I was in school, but the idea that objects at rest stay at rest, objects in motion stay in motion. I think that's very similar to this idea that, sometimes you just have to start doing something, and then that movement allows this momentum to happen. And that's exactly what I saw happen with this. Is now I'm energized and motivated to work on this podcast. And it allowed me to even open my reserves up, my energy reserves, to even figure out the sound quality and really dig into, how do I make this sound better, and figure out my microphone and everything like that. So yeah, I think throwing in some physics ideas there, if that's where that comes from. I'm so sorry if that's not where it comes from and I have that wrong. Please feel free to correct me. But yeah, really leaning into this idea that, like, once I started, the inspiration then followed. And taking this kind of a step back, I want to be able to reflect more broadly. So, as I just kind of mentioned before, the idea that, like, the culture, society, the world we live in idolizes productivity, but we are not really meant to be on all the time. It's so normal. It's such a human experience to have your productivity ebb and flow, your inspiration ebb and flow. Like, just think about your day to day. You are not the same person every single day. Like, you have different energy reserves. You maybe don't sleep well one day, or you eat healthier one day, whatever that looks like to you. Like, we are just not meant for always being on, and I want to just normalize the feeling of being uninspired because that is normal. That is okay. Additionally, challenging perfectionism. I think that was a big factor into, why I was participating in this avoidance and procrastination because there was that large feeling that the next episode had to be better than the first. There was this pressure to perform, and that just made it even harder to start doing what I needed to do. And then taking all of this and pulling it out to just think about how this could apply to life in general, which is just something I've been thinking about after going through this experience. Whether it's a creative project, a relationship, or just getting through the day, we all hit walls. That's okay. And that does not mean that you've failed. And I think this has been a lesson that I've really been trying to take from this is that hitting a wall is not a failure. It does not mean that you can't continue to try, that you can't push forward. Because at the end of the day, if we're thinking of a regular dry wall, plaster wall, whatever walls are made of, like 2x4s and plaster, drywall, whatever it is, those can easily be broken down. So there's nothing that's stopping you from being able to get through that wall that you've hit when it comes to your inspiration and motivation. You just got to get moving. You just got to give it a whirl. And that's the lesson that I'm trying to take away from this is that those walls can be broken down and you can do it, which is very similar, I feel like, to the first episode, just thinking of like, you can do the hard things. So moving us into just some actionable takeaways. And again, this is not meant to be advice or finding the perfect solution. I really just want this to be like the process I've gone through to quite literally process this event, and hopefully that helps give you some ideas or allows you to reflect on how you could maybe move forward. So some small steps, I think, now as I find myself moving forward, some small steps might be to just start messy and just begin. I think what I would caveat this with is that the way I kind of started getting into doing the second episode was, or this third episode, sorry, the episode I'm talking about right now, that you're listening to right now, is I started with an outline and it seemed very messy to me. It seemed like it was all over the place. It wasn't going to come together, but I knew from just listening to the other two episodes that I needed an outline to really help guide me as I go into this. And even though I thought it was going to be a messy outline because that was my initial reaction after pulling it together, it wasn't. This outline has worked. It's made sense. I'm now recording this podcast episode based off of that outline. So I would say my caveat here is that start messy, even though it might not be messy. It really might not. And that is a perception to just take with you as you go into this. Another option, which is very similar to what I was just doing with the outline, is breaking it into smaller tasks. I told myself that I had to record a full podcast. So instead of doing that, I just started with an outline. You could even start with the intro or just jotting down some random bullet points, which is honestly what my outline kind of looked like. It was more kind of random points that I was able to reconfigure into being an outline. And that messy outline has been working because here we are. And another small step might be to just take the pressure off. So this has been, I think, the biggest one that I've been working on and practicing with is just reminding myself that it doesn't have to be perfect. And specifically when it comes to this podcast, reminding myself that it doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be authentic, just has to be honest, because that is what I want this podcast to be. Another actionable takeaway is shifting perspective. So, this is probably also equally as important as the taking the pressure off and reminding myself that it doesn't have to be perfect. Avoidance isn't failure. And this is a truth that I am still working to accept because it's not. Avoidance does not equal failure. A way to reframe that is that it's often just a sign to slow down or reassess. And what feels like a setback can be a chance to realign. So I've been still working to take this to heart that there's many things in life that do not automatically mean they're failures. Like, for example, there was something at work that came up and I had to do something for my manager and I immediately took it as like, oh my God, it's a failure. Like I did something wrong. And that's just not the vibe. So I think this failure, this doing something wrong aspect is a larger theme for me that I'm working on shifting my perspective on. And I'm sure I will have upcoming episodes talking about that. But yeah, shifting your perspective. And finally, just also encouraging gratitude, being kind to yourself. I am really bad at doing that. You know, I'm very bad at that. I am doing better. Like, if you took who I was last year at this time, like, very different person. I'm a very different person now, and I'm really trying to practice gratitude and being kind to myself. But it's hard. It's really hard, especially when a lot of the messages I've received growing up and through my life have been negative. But it's important to celebrate that I'm showing up, even if it feels like or it is a messy process, even though I'll caveat again that it might not actually be messy in the long run once you get to the end. So, this was a good episode. I'm really glad I did this. I'm really glad I talked about this. I want to just bring it all together and say that, feeling uninspired is a part of being human. And it's messy, it's frustrating, it's annoying, but it's also a chance to reflect, grow, and keep moving forward. What's something you've been avoiding? How can you take one small step today, even if it's not perfect, even if it's quote unquote messy? You know what? What could you do right now that could help move you forward towards something that you've been avoiding doing? Thanks for being here with me through the ups and downs. And remember, even in those uninspired moments, you're still doing your best. As always, if you want to provide feedback or you have ideas for topics we can talk about or suggestions, feel free to email me at waytobehuman@gmail.com. And you're doing the best you can. Way to be human.